We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. And Pat, one of the planks in Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda platform is workers' comp reform. It's a bit of an esoteric issue for most people, unless you're in that space. But it turns out that the workers' comp costs in Illinois, particularly in the manufacturing sector, really are one of the drivers that make Illinois uncompetitive when it comes to decisions for businesses to stay in Illinois, much less to locate a new business in Illinois. And so this is an important topic. And actually, I was talking to an investigator friend of mine right now who does about 80% of his work right now is workers' comp fraud investigations. And he suggests about 80% of the workers' comp cases are fraudulent. And he talked to me about, I want to set up a website to show, if I could get the sign off to do it, to show what I see, to present the evidence of what I see in all these cases. So, even beyond the fraud component of it, which is a substantial one, just structurally, it's a system that leaves Illinois behind. And we see this bear out. Since the end of the recession, since we started to pick up out of the recession, Michigan, 117,000 manufacturing jobs recovered. Illinois, 17,000 manufacturing jobs recovered. And workers' comp has something to do with that.
Yeah, I talk about this issue, Dan, all over the state. It's part of the governor's turnaround agenda, and it is a little esoteric, and some people might think it's even a little bit boring, but it's so important. What's happening here is there's a structural cost added to manufacturing companies mainly, and we're right next to Indiana, and we're close to Michigan, and we're close to Iowa. And these manufacturers who hire a lot of people can leave the state, move across state lines, still get a lot of the benefits of living near Chicago or near Illinois and having their workers live nearby and get much, much lower costs. So it's something that the public should pay attention to. And those stats that you gave earlier, just this year, Dan, 7,500 manufacturing jobs net lost in Illinois, 5,000 gained in Indiana. So they're moving literally from there across the border, from here across the border to there because of this and other structural cost issues.
And it's not just the manufacturing sector. That was just an example. But we're now joined by Don Hayter, who's the director of the Center for Nonprofit Management at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Business. And it's also the nonprofit sector that's impacted by the workers' comp system in Illinois. Don, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
By the way, a quick aside, Don Hayter, the last, I would say, center-right, and maybe even just the last sensible candidate for mayor in the city of Chicago. A lot of people don't know that. Right, Don?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, 2019's not so far away, Don. I'm just saying, something to consider. So tell us about work comp as it impacts a sector that's not talked about enough, at least in this space of the conversation about workers' comp reform, and that's the nonprofit sector where you have expertise.
Well, let me talk about workers' comp generally, because it incorporates, the public not-for-profit and the for-profit sectors. Everybody's impacted by it in the state of Illinois, where we're kind of an outliner among other states in the country. We have some of the highest workmen's compensation costs in the country. And it is a problem to the extent that it affects our business climate here. It's an irritant. We're surrounded by states that have reformed their workers' comp, have much lower workers' compensation rates, and it's an irritant of doing business here in Chicago or throughout the state of Illinois, and largely because it's an uncertainty, and business likes certainty. Any organization likes certainty, and to know what its fixed costs are going to be and what its variable costs are going to be, and so we need to do a better job on it.
Hey, Don, it's Pat Hughes. Thanks so much for joining us. One of the issues that I find when I talk about this, when I travel around the state, obviously it's a big part of the governor's reform agenda, but it's hard to make it appealing or attractive to the public because it's like Dan said earlier, a little esoteric. How can we message people who think that this reform is so critical to business growth in Illinois? How do you go about messaging the issue to change that so the public recognizes its importance and gets agitated and involved to help make that change?
That's a good question. I think you look at what your competitors are doing, Indiana in particular, for example. highlights the workmen's compensation differential between Illinois and Indiana as one of the incentives of companies moving to Indiana or relocating or starting a factory or business over there. So our competitors are using it against us, and it is one of the threats, and that is simply saying it may not be a huge factor in doing business. I mean, there are other factors that are far more critical to the business climate of Illinois, particularly the tax uncertainty and our pension liabilities and so forth. But it is part and parcel of the business climate that it says a message to the business community. We really don't care.
Don, I think one of the things we need to do in terms of freeing ourselves from the restraints is to figure out how we got tied down in the first place. So how did Illinois get this uncompetitive workers' comp system as compared to some of our neighbors?
Oh, boy. I mean, there are better minds than I that go back to kind of the history of how we got caught up in this.
And maybe another way to say is what features of our workers' comp system are distinguishable from our neighboring states?
It's a no-fault system. So, to recover your claim, the employer has to kind of simply bear the cost while the person's out of work and for his past wages. And so this is a standards issue. And we look at the standards of Illinois versus competitive states for workers' comp to be compensable. Our standards are not as tight. We could lift our standards up. And
when you say lift our standards up, is it areas like comparative fault for the injury, things like that?
It's exactly. The accident is primarily work related,
right? Okay,
and other states have that, and it just sends a message rather than you have an injury and you got it in touch football, it's a recurring injury, or it happened under other conditions other than your place of work.
Don, that's how Dan gets all his injuries. He plays a lot of touch football,
right,
on Thanksgiving and powder puff with the ladies. So is it? It strikes me that the issue is somebody's incentivized to have the system this way, and it strikes me just as an old lawyer that it's the trial bar, that plaintiffs' lawyers who represent these causes of action, they want it to be as easy to prove as possible, and that's sort of how the system is being structured. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that's certainly one of the incentives, and one of the perverse impacts of this is you do have a sizable interest group that captures rents from other people's earnings and compensation, and that's the trial lawyers. But it's also been a organizing force for labor in the state of Illinois, and it's something that brought them together. So I think it's a tough thing to break out, and the trial lawyers have been very generous to the Democratic Party. So what the governor is doing in a lot of these things of labor reform, he's going at the heart of how the Democratic Party in the state of Illinois is financed, and how people are compensated, and how they're incentivized, and the glue that holds the fabric together. And that's why this has become such a contentious standoff between the governor and the legislature.
We're talking to Don Hayter. He's the former CFO and budget director for the city of Chicago, a mayoral candidate for the city of Chicago once upon a time, and now the director of the Center for Nonprofit Management at Kellogg up at Northwestern. And Don, I want to get back to the nonprofit because a lot of ink is being dedicated right now, TV time dedicated right now to social service providers in the state that are not being paid for the quality services they provide, the needed services they provide because of the budget impasse. But it seems to me, again, like a private sector business, one of their cost drivers, and I've heard anecdotal stories about this, the $600,000 ankle sprain. Well, when a nonprofit has those kind of workers' comp costs as well, that eats up their monies for programmatic work, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look at, Mayor Emanuel's come out for workmen's compensation reform because it's a big cost factor for the city of Chicago. I can remember back in years that we had members in Streets and Sand because of the temporary work, and they'd be laid off during winter months, that all of a sudden they'd have these inexplicable accidents in November and December just before the temporary holidays, before they'd go off work. And so it is a cost factor. I'm not saying that exists today, but there's a legacy here. and it's a legacy that we got to tighten up, and it's part and parcel of making Illinois more business-friendly and improving the business climate of Illinois.
All right. He is Don Hader, the Director of Center for Nonprofit Management at Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern. Don, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Great. Enjoy talking to you. Bye.